In 2010, a British lawyer named David Henderson-Stewart boarded a plane to Saint Petersburg. He had never visited a watch factory. He had never even owned a mechanical watch. He did not know, until someone explained it to him a year earlier, the difference between a quartz movement and a mechanical one. But he had spent over a decade living in Russia, and he had heard about a factory on the outskirts of the city that was still, somehow, making watches. What he found when he arrived was not what you picture when you think of a watch manufacturer. There were about 20 people inside. They were old. The windows were broken. It was the middle of winter, and nobody had coats off because the heating barely worked. Soviet-era machines, some of them dating back decades, were lined up on a factory floor built for thousands. And in the middle of all of it, the watches these people were building were going tick-tock. They worked. Henderson-Stewart picked one up, turned it over, and realized he was holding something that most of the watch industry would consider impossible. This factory was producing its own mechanical movements entirely in-house, from raw metal to finished watch, including the hairspring and the escapement, two components so difficult to manufacture that almost no watchmaker on Earth even attempts it. Rolex does it, the Swatch Group does it, and this frozen, half-abandoned building on the outskirts of Saint Petersburg was doing it too. The factory was 300 years old, and it had survived things that would have killed any normal business 10 times over. This is the story of Raketa. To understand how a watch factory ended up in this condition, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is not what you would expect, because this place did not start out making watches at all. In 1721, Peter the Great, the Tsar who was busy dragging Russia into the modern age, founded a workshop in Peterhof, just outside his new capital of Saint Petersburg. He had traveled through Europe and seen the hard stone carving traditions of the Western courts, the ability to cut and polish semi-precious and precious stones into decorative objects of extraordinary beauty. Russia was sitting on massive deposits of these stones in the Ural and Altai mountains, and Peter wanted a workshop that could turn them into something worthy of his empire. So the Imperial Peterhof Lapidary Works was born. Its job was simple: take the raw mineral wealth of Russia and transform it into luxury objects for the palaces of the Tsars. And it did exactly that for generations. The craftsmen at Peterhof carved stone for the fountains of Saint Petersburg. They produced marble elements for St. Isaac's Cathedral. They created decorative pieces that ended up in the Hermitage, in Versailles, in the Louvre. In 1844, the factory produced a table with a detailed stone mosaic as a gift for Queen Victoria of England. A workshop in the suburbs of St. Petersburg was producing objects that sat in the palaces of Western Europe's most powerful monarchs. Catherine the Great, who had a particular obsession with hard stones, sent Peterhof specialists on expeditions deep into the Ural and Altai mountains to discover new minerals. These raw stones were brought back to the factory and transformed into works of art that reflected what Catherine wanted the world to see when it looked at Russia, a civilization of sophistication and precision, not the backwater that Western Europe often assumed. The factory became one of the leading creators of luxury goods on the entire continent. It could only produce items upon the personal instruction of the emperor or empress. It belonged to the crown the way a jeweler belongs to a royal court. Then, in the 1890s, the factory took its first step toward the world of timekeeping. Peterhof's craftsmen began collaborating with the Talberg Company to produce precision-cut pocket watches, applying their stoneworking expertise to the delicate mechanics of horology. It was not watchmaking yet, but it was the beginning of the skills that would eventually save the factory's life. For nearly 2 centuries, the factory served the Tsars. It worked exclusively on imperial commissions. It answered to the crown. And then, in 1917, the crown ceased to exist. The Russian Revolution could have been the end of the story. A factory that existed to make luxury goods for emperors does not have an obvious role in a worker's state. But the craftsmen at Peterhof had a skill set that turned out to be remarkably adaptable. They knew how to cut stone with precision. They knew how to work with hard materials at scales ranging from enormous to tiny. And the new Soviet government, whatever its feelings about Tsarist luxury, needed people who could do that kind of work. So the factory adapted. In 1924, it produced the stone facing for Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square, the very heart of the new Soviet state. Then, in 1935, came something even more visible. The Moscow Kremlin needed its old Imperial double-headed eagles replaced with giant stars made of ruby glass to celebrate the anniversary of the October Revolution. The Peterhof factory got the job. Those stars, glowing red on top of the Kremlin towers, are still there today. They were manufactured by the same people who had once carved gemstones for Catherine the Great. But here is where the factory's path takes a turn that connects everything. In 1938, the Peterhof works began manufacturing synthetic ruby stones. Not for jewelry, for watches. Mechanical watch movements need tiny ruby bearings at friction points because ruby does not wear down the way metal does. The factory became the primary supplier of these rubies to the growing Soviet watch industry. A 300-year-old stone-cutting workshop was now feeding the precision needs of an entirely different craft. And then, the Nazis arrived. During World War II, the siege of Leningrad became one of the most devastating events in modern history. German forces surrounded the city for nearly 900 days. The Peterhof area, located on the southern outskirts, was directly in the path of the German advance. Between 1941 and 1944, the factory was completely destroyed, not damaged. Not partially wrecked, completely destroyed. Centuries of accumulated skill, equipment, and infrastructure were reduced to rubble by artillery and occupation. That should have been the end. 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge and tooling wiped from the map. Any factory that suffers total destruction in wartime typically stays destroyed. The land gets cleared. Something else gets built. The people scatter and the skills disappear. But in 1944, as Soviet forces liberated the area, reconstruction began almost immediately. And this is the moment where the factory's identity changed forever. Joseph Stalin had a problem. The Soviet Union depended on Western imports for many precision instruments, including watches. Stalin wanted that dependency eliminated, so he gave an order. The rebuilt Peterhof factory would manufacture wristwatches. The brand name was chosen by Stalin himself. Pobeda, victory. The first prototypes came out by the end of 1945, time to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany. By 1949, the factory was producing watches in earnest, and in 1954, it was officially renamed the Petrodvorets Watch Factory. Throughout the 1950s, the factory launched a string of brands: Baltika, Leningrad, Mayak, Neva, all powered by movements designed and built on site. But the moment that defined the factory forever came on April 13, 1961, when a 27-year-old Soviet cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin climbed into the Vostok 1 spacecraft and became the first human being to orbit the Earth. The factory renamed its flagship watch line in his honor, Raketa, the Russian word for rocket. The timing could not have been better, and not just for symbolic reasons. Raketa's engineers were producing some genuinely impressive work. In the early 1960s, they developed the caliber 2209, an ultra-thin movement measuring just 2.7 millimeters in height. To put that in perspective, stack 2 Soviet 5 kopek coins on top of each other and you have the height of this movement. It won a gold medal at the 1965 Leipzig Trade Fair and another prize at the 1967 World Exhibition in Montreal. This was not propaganda. The movement competed against Swiss and German watchmaking and held its own. Then, in 1969, the Soviet government came to Raketa with a specific request. They needed a watch for polar explorers. The Soviet Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute had a problem that most people never think about. When you are living at the North or South Pole, there are periods when the sun never sets and periods when it never rises. A normal 12-hour watch face becomes useless because you cannot tell whether it is 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. So, Raketa's engineers, led by specialists named Kiselev and Starkov, designed a movement where the hour hand made one complete rotation every 24 hours instead of 2. the dial showed all 24 hours at once. The first batch was delivered in 1970, just in time for the 16th Soviet Antarctic expedition, departing from Leningrad by ship. The explorers reached Antarctica in time to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the continent's discovery by Russian explorers in 1820. The polar watch was not available to civilians for years. It was reserved for Arctic researchers, submarine crews, cosmonauts, and Air Force pilots, anyone who worked in conditions where the difference between day and night was not obvious. The woman who helped engineer the 24-hour complication, Ludmila Voynik, was still working at the Raketa factory more than 50 years later, heading the construction bureau that relaunched a limited run of the original polar movement. By the 1970s, the factory had reached a scale that is hard to believe for a watch manufacturer. 8,000 employees worked on the floor. Production hit 5 million watches per year. Raketa was exporting to 38 countries worldwide. Many of the civilian models had their dials printed in English specifically for foreign markets. The factory was the largest employer in the Peterhof region, and the sprawling complex was practically a self-contained Soviet village with its own housing blocks, nurseries, schools, and social centers for the workers and their families. The brand had developed over 50 different calibers of mechanical movements. It supplied watches to the Interior Ministry, the Russian Railways, the Red Army, the Soviet Navy, and the Air Force. If you wore a uniform in the Soviet Union, there was a decent chance you had a Raketa on your wrist. Then came the watch that turned Raketa into something more than a timepiece. The Big Zero. The original design was created for the All-Russian Society for the Blind, an organization that collaborated with Soviet industry to improve products for visually impaired citizens. The watch featured an oversized numeral at every hour position, thick hands, and a high-contrast dial for maximum legibility. But instead of a 12 at the top of the dial, the designers placed a 0. Time started from 0, not from 12. It was a practical choice for readability, and then Mikhail Gorbachev turned it into a political statement. According to the story that has become inseparable from the watch itself, Gorbachev was attending an international summit in Italy during the mid-1980s. Journalists asked him to explain what perestroika, his program of political and economic restructuring, actually meant for the Russian people. Instead of giving a long answer, Gorbachev raised his wrist and pointed to his Raketa Big Zero. "The Russian people," he said, "want to start everything from zero, just like my watch." Italian newspapers ran the story the next day. Whether the anecdote happened exactly that way is debated by collectors, but the effect was real. Italian entrepreneurs saw the Big Zero and immediately placed orders, interpreting the design as the perfect symbol of perestroika. New versions flooded the market. Black dials, Soviet symbols, pocket watches, holographic variants. A watch designed for people who could not see well became the most recognized Soviet timepiece in the world. Raketa also produced the official watches for the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games. The factory was at the absolute height of its power. Soviet state support, a massive workforce, global exports, and cultural cachet that no marketing budget could buy. And then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and almost everything went with it. The transition from a planned economy to capitalism devastated Russian manufacturing across the board, but for a company like Raketa, it was catastrophic. The factory had never needed to find customers. The state told it how many watches to build, and the state distributed them. Overnight, that entire system vanished. Orders dried up, funding disappeared. Workers left because there was no money to pay them. One by one, the factory's production lines went dark. At its peak, Raketa had operated roughly 50 separate manufacturing lines, including the critical line that produced hairsprings, the tiny coiled springs that regulate a mechanical watch's accuracy and are among the hardest components in all of watchmaking to produce. 49 of those 50 lines shut down. The equipment sat idle. Buildings across the sprawling complex fell into disrepair. What kept the factory alive at all was a skeleton crew. A small group of aging workers, many of them specialists who had been at the factory for decades, refused to abandon the one remaining production line. They kept the machines running. They continued to fulfill small orders from the Russian military and government agencies that still needed watches. They worked through winters with broken windows and failing heat. And they did this for nearly 20 years. The rest of Russia's watch industry was not so fortunate. The great Soviet watch factories fell one after another. Poljot, the prestigious Moscow manufacturer, closed its doors. Slava, another Moscow institution, went under. Across the former Soviet Union, the infrastructure that had produced millions of mechanical watches every year simply ceased to exist. By the late 2000s, the Petrovoritz watch factory was the last one standing. The oldest factory in Russia was also, by default, the only watchmaker left. This is where David Henderson-Stewart enters the story. He was living in Moscow, working as a lawyer, when someone mentioned the difference between quartz and mechanical watches to him at a dinner party. That conversation sent him down a research path. He started reading watch blogs and forums and discovered that Soviet watches had a surprisingly dedicated international collector community. He also discovered that almost every Soviet watch factory had closed. Almost. He took a plane to Saint Petersburg. He walked into the Petrovoritz factory, and he saw the 20 workers in their winter coats, hunched over vintage equipment, still making watches tick. Years later, he described that moment in an interview. "If I had been a specialist," he said, "I would never have gotten involved." He meant it. Anyone who understood the economics of watch manufacturing would have looked at that factory and seen a money pit. The buildings were crumbling. The workforce was tiny and aging. The brand had no presence in a market dominated by Swiss luxury names. Russian consumers, newly wealthy ones especially, did not want Russian watches. They wanted Rolex and Omega and Patek Philippe. The idea that a Russian factory could compete in the luxury market would have struck most industry observers as absurd. Henderson-Stewart saw something different. He saw 300 years of continuous history. He saw a factory that could still produce its own movements from raw materials to finished watches, a capability so rare that only a handful of companies on the planet possess it. He saw designs that carried real cultural weight, watches connected to Gagarin and the Arctic and the Kremlin and the Soviet space program. And he saw a group of people who had refused to let their factory die, even when every economic incentive told them to walk away. In 2009, Henderson-Stewart brought in Jacques von Polier, a French designer with Russian roots who had moved to Russia in the 1990s. Together with a small group of investors, they acquired the factory. The purchase included not just the equipment and the building, but something equally important. Raketa's entire archive of designs and technical drawings had been preserved. Decades of intellectual property, the blueprints for every movement the factory had ever produced, survived the chaos of the 1990s because the workers had protected them. The rebuilding was deliberate and unusual. Henderson-Stewart made a decision that defined everything that followed. He would not modernize the factory by throwing out the old equipment and buying Swiss CNC machines. He would not outsource movement production to save money. He would not turn Raketa into another brand that slapped its name on someone else's components. Instead, he kept the Soviet-era machinery. He retained every worker he found and improved their conditions. And he hired people who could bridge the gap between where the factory was and where it needed to be. Jean-Claude Quenet, who had been the director of escapements at Rolex and a former production head at Frank Muller, came to Saint Petersburg to bring Swiss haute horlogerie expertise to a Soviet-era factory floor. Xavier Giraudet, a veteran of Jaeger-LeCoultre and Blancpain, joined to assemble the ultra-premium Imperial Peterhof factory line by hand. These were people who had spent their careers at the pinnacle of Swiss watchmaking, and they chose to work in a factory where some of the machinery predated the fall of the Berlin Wall. Henderson-Stewart opened Russia's only watchmaking school on the factory premises in August of 2010 because he recognized a gap that no one else was filling. The Soviet Union had stopped training watchmakers decades ago. the existing workforce, the same people who had kept the machines alive through the dark years, would eventually retire. Without new blood, the factory's survival would be temporary, no matter how much investment came in. The school became a pipeline, training a new generation of Russian watchmakers from scratch in a country that had all but forgotten the craft existed. But the most symbolic hire connected the factory back to its very origins. Rostislav Romanov, a direct descendant of Peter the Great, joined the board of directors. The factory that Peter had founded 3 centuries earlier now had a Romanov at the table again. The first new Raketa collection under new management was released in early 2011. The brand debuted at Baselworld, the largest watch trade fair in the world. But the path to commercial success was not smooth. In the first 6 months after the relaunch, not a single Russian retailer would stock the watches. The idea that a domestic product could sit alongside Swiss brands in a Russian jewelry store was a hard sell. Henderson-Stewart had to prove the quality from the ground up. Today, the factory produces each Raketa watch using 242 separate components. The manufacturing process involves 103 specialists performing over 8,200 individual manual operations per watch. Soviet-era machines that were designed to stamp out millions of parts still run on the factory floor, alongside newer equipment added during the revival. The factory makes its own hairsprings from what it describes as a secret Soviet alloy. It produces its own escapements. It decorates its own movements with Russian-style guilloche work. It manufactures its own hands and many of its own dials. This level of vertical integration puts Raketa in an exclusive club. Most watch brands, even famous Swiss ones, buy their movements from external suppliers like ETA, a division of the Swatch Group. When ETA began restricting movement supplies to outside brands several years ago, it caused a crisis across the industry. Raketa watched that crisis from a distance. They did not depend on anyone. They never had. The watches themselves draw heavily on the factory's Soviet heritage. The Big Zero is back, still carrying that oversized zero where the 12 should be. The Polar collection still features the 24-hour dial designed for explorers who cannot see the sun. Models reference the Kremlin, the Russian avant-garde art movement, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and Soviet submarine crews. Prices run roughly from $700 to $3,500, placing them well below Swiss luxury competitors while emphasizing a completely different identity. The factory even took on a project that would have seemed unthinkable during the years of broken windows and skeleton crews. When fire devastated Notre-Dame de Paris in 2019, destroying the cathedral's historic clock, the French association working to restore the timepiece reached out across borders. The manufacturing knowledge for building enormous clockwork mechanisms had largely been lost in France. Raketa's engineers joined the effort, studying the design of the Notre-Dame clock movement and beginning work on components that could be produced at the Saint Petersburg factory. A Russian watch manufacturer, born from a Tsar's workshop, helping to rebuild one of the most famous clocks in Western Europe. The question of what Raketa is today does not have a simple answer. In 2025, the company posted a profit of 109 million rubles. More than 200 employees work at the factory, a fraction of the 8,000 who once filled the floor, but a tenfold increase from the 20 who kept the lights on. Western sanctions imposed after the war in Ukraine have, paradoxically, worked in Raketa's favor. Foreign luxury watch brands pulled out of Russia or had their supply chains disrupted. Domestic demand for Russian-made alternatives rose. Raketa's own supply chain was barely affected because they produce almost everything themselves. Vladimir Putin has been seen wearing a watch from the Imperial Peterhof factory, the bespoke offshoot Henderson-Stewart created for high-end commissions. Russian media interpreted it as an endorsement of domestic manufacturing, and interest in similar designs spiked. Whether that association helps or hurts the brand internationally is a question that depends on which market you are looking at. In Russia, it carries weight. In Europe and the Middle East, where Raketa still exports, the story of the factory itself tends to speak louder than any political figure. But what makes Raketa's story genuinely unusual is not the politics or the geopolitics. It is the survival itself. This factory has now existed under the Tsars, through the Russian Revolution, through the Soviet era, through a world war that reduced it to rubble, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through 20 years of near death, through a revival led by a foreigner who did not know how watches worked, and through international sanctions. 3 centuries, 5 completely different political systems. At least 3 moments where any reasonable observer would have declared the factory finished, and the watches are still ticking. The reason they are still ticking comes down to the same thing it has always come down to, going all the way back to 1721. Someone at this factory has always known how to do something difficult with their hands. Peter the Great hired stonecutters. Stalin ordered those stonecutters' descendants to build watches. The Soviet state trained 8,000 of them. And when the state vanished, 20 of those 8,000 chose to stay. That is not a business strategy. That is something closer to stubbornness, or devotion, or maybe just the simple belief that if you know how to make something well, you do not stop making it because the world outside the factory walls has gone sideways. Henderson-Stewart understood this when he walked in. He picked up a watch in a freezing building surrounded by people who had no economic reason to be there, and the watch was keeping perfect time. 300 years. Tsars, revolutions, a world war, a space race, an empire's collapse, and a resurrection nobody predicted. And inside the factory in Peterhof, the machines are still running, the hands are still moving, and time, as it always has in this building, starts from zero. If you found this story worth your time, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which part of Raketa's history surprised you the most. Every like helps this video reach more people who love these kinds of stories.